Hi, I'm extremely honored to interview my next guest, Mr. Shmuel Ashkenasi. He is one of the most well-respected musicians and teachers of our time. As a soloist, he has performed with orchestras such as the Berlin, the Vienna, the Boston, the Philadelphia, and the Stockholm. As a chamber musician, he led the Vermeer String Quartet for many decades. And as a teacher, he has been the violin professor at the Curtis Institute of Music since 2007. I was very fortunate to study with him there. I hope through this brief conversation, you can get some inspiration from him as well. Good evening, Mr. Ashkenazi. Thank you so much for being my guest. It is really my pleasure to talk with you about music. I know that you grew up in Israel. Can you please share some of your memories there?
Yes, Israel, when I was very young, and still is, per capita, one of the most cultural countries in the world. You know, it's a very small country. When I was little, they had 2.7 million people total, and they had a lot of theaters, orchestras, painters, poets, theater, opera, amazing for such a small country. So I grew up with a lot of culture around me. My first teacher was my uncle, who was an amateur. My family were very poor, and they couldn't afford to pay a teacher. And so I studied with my uncle, but he really was not very good, and he was an amateur. He was self-taught and so on. My luck was that my real first teacher migrated to Israel, and my family knew of her family, and so she auditioned me, and she didn't have any experience teaching whatsoever. Her name was Ilona Feher, and she became very, very famous because Pinky Zuckerman and Shlomo Mintz and Hagai Shacham and many others studied with her.
Yes.
But I was her very first student. And so she accepted me. I think I was 8 years old at that time. Yeah, and so I was very, very fortunate. She was a concert violinist from Hungary. And since my parents were very poor, she really didn't charge us. She just believed in my talent, and she gave me a lot of lessons, and very long lessons, and she was very dedicated. And so that's how I really became a violinist.
Yes, I actually watched her documentary on YouTube. She seems very, very strict.
She was more than strict. As good and great as she was brutally honest. Yeah, and so many times I was rather discouraged because she rarely showered me and her other students with any compliments.
Wow.
And when she did, it was very, very stingy, and that was her philosophy. Of course, she came from the Soviet bloc, you know, she was Hungarian, and it was during the Soviet time. And later I learned that many, many Soviet teachers are that way. They believe that you shouldn't shower a student with compliments, otherwise he may get conceited or not work as hard, etc. But I think it was not really very great because it made my experience very, very unpleasant.
I see. Then later, when you moved to the States, was it very different?
Yeah, it was very, very, very different because I came to the Curtis Institute and I studied with a cymbalist who was also the director of the school. And he was the opposite. He was extraordinarily gentle, kind, very complimentary. He was, of course, quite old and a bit deaf. And so I don't know that when I went to him, that he was all that great, since he was somewhat deaf and extremely nice. But nevertheless, I was very fortunate to study the first year with his assistant, Toshia Eto, who was a Japanese student of his who became his assistant. And he was very important for me. He taught me why music is so beautiful and why is it so important. And so that was the first time that I became a musician, really, not a violinist, and that was really important for me. Well, I emphasize singing when the music is singing. Sometimes the music can be percussive, or sometimes it can be almost ugly. And so I hope that I can inspire my student to be able to change colors in their sound, because I think that that's a very, very important aspect of being a musician or an artist. I think that a very important part of every teacher is to make the students love music even more and inspire them to appreciate the privilege of being a musician. And so I hope that even though I am very strict and I'm very detailed, that I'm also quite artistic, poetic, singing, as you said, and with the ability to be very expressive with the instrument.
Do you always sort of separate music making from life?
No, absolutely not. And I hope that with my strictness in the classroom, I'm also compassionate and that I am not personal. This is one of the things that I missed with my first teacher, that she could become very personal. And I hope that I am not personal, and that I don't make my students feel like they are any lesser of a human being because they play out of tune, or they scratch, or they don't play the music the way is an ideal way. And so I do try not to be personal and not to put the student down, but I am very demanding, and I'm strict with details and with the style and with long phrases and whatever I think the music needs to have. Well, I would encourage young students to listen to the old artists, because I think there is quite an evolution of the way the music and the instrument are taught today. There is a great emphasis on intonation, quality of sound, rhythm, but there is not much attention given to expression, colors, diversity, changing the contact point of the bow, changing the vibrato, glissandoing. All of those things are a big neglect, and so I would encourage my students to listen to the old generation, because they have an individual voice that is very, very expressive and artistic, and they go well beyond the notes. They go into the meaning and the character and the style. And so that's what I miss a lot in the current generation of most of the students that I hear in competitions or in auditions, etc. Yeah.
Maybe it has something to do with recordings or competitions.
Yes, the amazing thing is that actually, considering that the old generation of violinists did not have the luxury of splicing, and considering that they really couldn't fix everything like we can,
Mm-hmm.
It's amazingly great technically as well. I mean, they play nearly very, very perfect,
Yeah.
technically speaking. And so they were not only great masters of the instrument, but they also had an individual voice,
Mm-hmm.
which today there is a kind of a generic approach or sound. So when I hear young violinists in competitions, maybe 19 out of 20 sound the same. Very, very good technically, but very, very unartistic, not full of imagination, and rather monotonous.
Mm-hmm. Do you see the difference between countries style-wise?
I don't actually. I actually don't identify when people talk about Russian style and French style and Asian style. I actually don't find that
Mm-hmm.
it matters. I think that talent is very important, but the race and where you come from, I don't think is a very big factor. I mean, when I was very young, most of the celebrated violinists were Jewish.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But I don't really think that it is in the genes or in the religion or in the culture.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it has to do with the fact that Misha Elman
Mm-hmm.
made a career, a very, very great career. And I think that every mother wanted her child to go in his footsteps because that gave an opportunity for him to succeed and get out of the ghetto mentality and also financial limitations. And so, and the fact of the matter is that today,
Mm-hmm.
most of the great violinists by numbers are from Korea, from China, from Germany, and not so much Jewish anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really don't think that it has to do with the race or with the geography. I think it has to do with, well, the parents pushing
Mm-hmm.
their children in a direction. And of course, we know about Korea and China. Every competition is full of young Koreans and Chinese today. There are some, of course, Jewish excellent violinists as well, but by numbers they are no longer as predominant as they used to be.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting because the reason I studied violin was because my grandpa, a Chinese violinist, studied with a Jewish musician in Shanghai.
I
So
see.
it's a very interesting transition, I guess.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit like tennis or baseball.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was young, there were practically no great players from Sweden. And then Bjorn Borg became world famous. He was number one. He won, I don't know, 5 or 7 times.
Mm-hmm.
And within 5 years, 5 of the best 15 tennis players were Swedish.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in violin or piano, it's very similar.
Mm-hmm.
After you had Lang Lang and Yuja, now you have so many Chinese pianists, and I think the violin is coming as well, and I think the chamber music is going to come as well in time.
Right.
Well, the advice that I have for chamber musicians who are a steady group, not like in a festival. In a festival, there is not so much time that you can afford to argue or be terribly detailed because you have limited rehearsal time. But if you are a string quartet that is married to each other, or a piano trio, or another combination of musicians, I have kind of a formula whereby if an individual totally disagrees with a colleague, but it's not very important, I think he should let it go.
Mm-hmm.
you know, the group just saved maybe 25 minutes. And if it's not very important, I think that one should address what is very important. On the other hand, if it is very, very important, I think one should fight for it. The difficulty is being enough mature to distinguish between what is important and what isn't important. And the third way is to compromise, but I think most of the time compromise is not very good for the music. You don't have it that way, you don't have it this way, and it's kind of middle of the road. However, if it is tempo, compromise is usually very good. If member A thinks it should be very fast and member B thinks it should be much slower, usually in the middle will be just right. So I think that if one applies these three layers of attention or criticism, I think you save a lot of time.
Especially maybe in the older generation, more first violin focused. But nowadays, people tend to be a bit more, let's say, democratic. So yeah, musically speaking, I think it also changes.
Well, sorry.
No worries.
That's my dog.
Yeah.
I do think that the old style, when in a string quartet the first violinist had dominance, is really not just. It's not just. I think that everyone should have equal say. However, with the emancipation of especially the middle voices, but all the members, a lot of problems were created. And even though I think that it's right and just, it also makes life much more complicated, and a lot more time is devoted to arguing and fighting, and so it's a little bit like the emancipation of the feminist movement. It was way overdue, and it's very just, and it's healthy, and it's very, very great that it is happening. But it also created a lot of problems because mainly men were not ready for it, and so the string quartet also now. There are many more arguments, and a lot more time is, well, I don't want to say wasted, but spent on arguments and discussions. Whereas in the past, if the first violinist was a great musician, it was not just, but it was efficient and effective. And so, with the emancipation of all the voices in a string quartet, I think that it's correct and just, but it also makes life a lot more complicated and difficult.
Thank you. It's a lot like politics.
Well, it is social. It's a social. There are social dimensions to it. In my quartet, we decided early that unless we are playing a fugue or a fugal entry, when everybody has to sound the same, we will criticize and suggest, but at the end of the day, let the person who is playing the principal voice have an extra vote or have freedom to express himself without considering the others, so that it's better if you play convincingly your way rather than unconvincingly what another member may think is correct or better.
Yeah.
So in that case, yes, the first violin, since he has most of the time the principal voice, especially in the classical and romantic literature, he gets his way, but hopefully he's also open to suggestions and criticisms, and he can take them seriously and try to incorporate them or to change the way he thinks of a phrase.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. My gosh, that's an enormous task I love the old way that the violinists used to play, like Chrysler, Thibault, Szigeti, Menuhin, Heifetz, Franciscatti, Isaac Stern, and of course my absolute favorite string player was Pablo Casals.
Oh, yes.
I was fortunate to experience him alive in Marlborough when I played for him in a master class, and I actually played with him. And so, I really thought that he was the most sublime string player of any that I've ever heard. I miss a lot of those artists. I also loved, Schnabel and many pianists. Today I love Mary Pariah and Radu Lupu and Polini. I love the pianists who are able to draw the audience to them by playing softly rather than bang and play very, very loud and very percussive.
Yeah.
I feel that about string playing too, that it's very important. There is a very big emphasis on big sound, and because the halls are big and the orchestras are loud, there's a very big emphasis on playing with a big sound, and but that has the danger that you are throwing or communicating the music towards the audience. But I think that there is another way which makes the audience listen very attentively when you are able to play softly and with a great distinction and great artistry, and it makes the audience listen much more attentively. Of course, it's very important to be heard when you play in a big hall and with a loud orchestra. It's very important, because otherwise it's no use to be a great artist if you cannot be heard. But I think that too much emphasis is put on a big sound and playing everything loud and louder. I think that intimacy is missing a lot of the time.
Do you think it has something to do with change of culture?
I don't. I don't. I'm sure that in the culture there are tendencies. I mean by that mainly that parents can be more encouraging or more insisting on the children practicing more or listening more, or and that has a certain influence. But I think that in the genes, I very much want to believe, and I do believe, that Asian people can play German music and German music can play Russian music, etc. I don't think that it's necessary to be off the culture. I mean, I guess in the pop culture, there is an awful lot of volume that comes from just turning the button.
Yeah.
But I am very amazed when I hear Radu Lupu, for instance, play. Every year he plays softer and softer, and the audience is mesmerized. They are almost in a hypnotic trance.
Yes.
Because he makes them really listen very, very attentively, because he plays so beautifully and so softly. And so I think it's important to appreciate that aspect of playing. I often emphasize to my students to try and play big rather than loud. Loud is when a parent shouts at his children, to the point that after a while they cannot hear it anymore, and they kind
Yes.
of have a. But when a parent speaks with wisdom, it doesn't have to be very loud, but it gets the attention of the child or the audience, as it were. My quartet existed for 39 years. And the first 20 years or 19 years, we had a lot of changes in the membership of the quartet.
Mm-hmm.
At one point, we even had 2 members leave the quartet. And every time it was very, very depressing and very challenging because we had a career, quite a successful one.
Mm-hmm.
And when a member leaves the quartet, you don't have a single piece that you're ready to play, and you're responsible to play maybe 60, 80, 100 concerts in a season.
Mm-hmm.
And many times I was very, very discouraged and motivated to stop and do something else. But the fact that I still had maybe 100 masterpieces to fall in love with kept me very, very motivated. And so the quality of the music, which is of course the greatest literature, the string quartet literature, is so rich. That's the thing that made me want to continue. Now I don't perform so much. I'm almost 80 years old. But I teach quite a lot, and I love it, and I feel that my contribution can be significant because some of my students will be teachers, and so the fact that I teach at one point maybe 18 students, every one of them may teach also 18 or 15 or 20 students, and so it's a mushrooming effect, and I hope that my influence is really growing, and I hope that I can influence the trend to move in the direction of a century ago,
Mm-hmm.
when violin playing was more in the direction of artistry, poetry, colors, imagination, while being still a scientific musician and a great technician.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things are very important, but I find that today there is not so many colors, and there are not so many slides, and there are not so many changes of vibrato, and there are not so many changes of bow speed and bow articulation.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds well, it sounds healthy, but it sounds the same. And that's what I try to instill in my students, is the possibility to mesmerize their audience with color and with poetry and with artistry and imagination and character and those things. Yeah.
Audience, these things are so special, and thank you for doing that. And
Yeah.
yeah,
That makes me very happy to hear.
oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I really hope that you keep inspiring more people, not just musicians, but also for music lovers, because you're just, whenever you play, we are always just so mesmerized, really not just by your playing, but really by the emotion and the message you convey through your playing.
Thank you.
Yeah. And yeah, thank you so much.
My pleasure.